Hi, I'm Patty Durell, the CEO of Rock Solid Fitness and a licensed physical therapist assistant, and more importantly, an educator. One of the things that I believe through my experience in life as a physical therapist assistant and an exercise fitness coach is that every human being should lay on their stomach every day. Why do I believe that? I believe it because our hip flexors over time get shortened in a shortened length, especially in those of us who have positions in life where we're sitting a lot. So when we sit, our hip flexes, and the muscle that makes our hip flex can get shortened from staying in this position for a very long time. And when we sit a lot and that muscle gets shortened, when we try to stand up, all of a sudden, because that muscle's short, we can't extend into a neutral position any longer. And so what happens is we get pulled forward at our pelvis over time, which makes our knees bend, and our hamstrings are probably tight from sitting as well. And what most people don't know is this hip flexor chain. One of your quadricep muscles flexes your hip. There's two muscles in your hip girdle that flex your hip as well. They're called the iliacus and the psoas major muscle. They form a common tendon, and they're typically called the iliopsoas muscle. And the psoas muscle attaches to the anterior part of some of your lumbar vertebrae. So when your hip flexor muscles get tight and you're like this, that psoas muscle that attaches to the anterior part of your vertebrae, when you try to straighten up, it pulls your vertebrae forward. And so anytime you try and make your hips at a 0 degrees of extension or flexion, that psoas muscle is short and it's pulling some of your lumbar vertebrae forward, creating a very abnormal, stressful position for your lumbar vertebrae and discs, and it causes pain. One of the ways we might find this show up in people is simply when we teach them how to stretch their hip flexors and we get them into that position, they don't feel it in the muscle as much as they feel it in their low back. So let me show you what you could do if you have a very sedentary job, or if you've been sitting a lot, or even if you notice you have tight hip flexors and you're leaning over, or maybe your tight hip flexors show up with an anterior pelvic tilt or a big curve in your back. This is what you can do to stretch out your hip flexor muscles. So you could just simply go on the floor on your stomach. Remember, this is what I said. I believe every human body should get in this position every day, just to lay on their stomach. And when we lay on our stomach, our hip has to be in at least 0 degrees of extension. When we're on our back, we're not always in 0 degrees of extension, especially if we're sitting in a recliner or laying in a recliner, or maybe we have the foot of our bed elevated, which is such a common thing nowadays, or we are putting a pillow underneath our knees when we sleep to alleviate back pain. That might actually be increasing more tightness in your hips and more back pain over time. So to stretch your hip flexors, you could simply start by laying on your belly. If you have really tight hip flexors and a really tight psoas muscle, just laying on your stomach could hurt your back when that psoas muscle is pulling your vertebrae forward. You could also start really gently and kind of what I call in the back door by just bending your knee. That's going to get that quadricep muscle, that hip that flexes your hip, and it will also start to stretch your iliopsoas muscles as well. You can do that. If you really want to get to your psoas, you can come up on what we call prone on elbows. Prone is just laying on your stomach. You could push up on your elbows, and you can see now that I'm starting to get more of a stretch here in my abdominal pelvic girdle area. So that's going to get more of my iliopsoas muscle. And if you have a really tight iliacus and psoas muscle, this position is going to hurt your low back. There could be other reasons too why this position would hurt your low back. But if you find yourself with that tight muscle and this is hurting, ease off, back off, and try to just stretch a little gentler. Maybe just start with your knees flexed. The other way that you can stretch your psoas muscle is to get into what I would call a split stance. You could do this standing or sitting. If your psoas muscle is really tight, you're going to be pulling over, and you might not be stretching it because now all of a sudden my whole body isn't supported, right? But this is a good way that I can stretch the psoas muscle and the hip flexor. I'm stretching it on my right leg as you're looking at me, and I could just kind of lean into it. But the goal is to keep my chest and my upper body parallel to the wall in front of me, and never any pain or shaking when stretching. You're just trying to get that muscle to relax a little bit in a little bit of a lengthened position. And of course, the best way to stretch a muscle is with resistance exercise training. So hip flexors are tough to get with that. We try to do it through what we call a reverse lunge. And then when we come down, we try and go to that point of stretch. We could tell when we're over exerting because that muscle is tight and pulling us forward. So we're just going to try and do a reverse lunge action here where we can stretch that muscle by coming down a little bit and then back up. So that would be resistance training. As we're doing reverse lunges here, we're also stretching the muscle. So thank you very much. Please lay on your belly once a day and take care of that hip flexor muscle chain that you have. You'll be happier and healthier as you age. You won't be one of those little people walking around like this. Thank you, Patty Durell from Rock Solid Fitness.